I had barely switched off my phone's navigation app when I saw it. A massive Ferris wheel piercing the cloudy sky, rising from what should have been nothing but rows of apple trees on my grandfather's orchard. My name is Ethan Lewis, and up until a week ago, I had no idea that the Hawthorne Heights HOA, led by a woman named Mariana Caldwell, was transforming my cherished family land into a sprawling amusement park. The orchard was my grandfather's pride and joy. For generations we tended those trees, forging a bond between the soil and our family's name. But it had been 3 years since I'd stepped foot in the small town of Redfield, Oregon. After graduating law school, I specialized in environmental cases across the country. I'd earned a reputation for taking on corporate polluters, unscrupulous developers, and anyone else who showed blatant disregard for nature's delicate balance. Grandfather's orchard and Redfield itself often felt like a distant memory. I traveled constantly, never staying in one place for long. Yet all that changed when I received a frantic call from Mr. Gordon, the aging caretaker who'd watched over the land in my absence. "I'm sorry to call, Ethan. Your orchard's being torn up for rides and roller coasters," he whispered, voice shaking. "It's the Hawthorne Heights HOA. They've claimed they have rights to the property. I can't make sense of it." I felt a cold dread sink in. That orchard was meant to be a haven of biodiversity. Grandpa had planted nearly a dozen heirloom apple varieties there, some extremely rare, and now an HOA, a group that typically polices paint colors and lawn lengths, was somehow running a theme park? As I drove past the orchard's gated entrance, my stomach twisted at the neon signs, half-installed roller coaster tracks, and construction crews bustling around. Bulldozers had chewed up rows of old apple trees, leaving scattered limbs and shredded bark in their wake. The sweet, earthy smell of rotting fruit clashed with the acrid stench of diesel fumes. How could they have done this so quickly? I parked on a patch of grass near the main fence. A pair of security guards in matching polo shirts approached, suspicious of my presence. One raised a hand to stop me. "Sir, this is private property. We can't let you inside the construction area." His tone left little room for debate. "This is my family's land," I snapped, stepping closer. "My grandfather, Charles Lewis, owned this orchard for 40 years. The guard exchanged a glance with his partner, both of them looking uncertain. They likely had no clue about property rights or orchard history. They were just following orders from the HOA. Furious but trying to keep composure, I demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. Within minutes, I found myself face to face with Mariana Caldwell, a tall, impeccably dressed woman in her early 40s. She wore a tailored blazer, and her expression radiated that chilly confidence of someone accustomed to snapping her fingers and getting results. "You must be Ethan Lewis," she said, forcing a polite smile. "We've been expecting you. My board mentioned that you might try to interfere with our new entertainment complex." I almost laughed at the word interfere, as if I were some random bystander meddling in her grand plan. "This orchard wasn't for sale," I said, voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Who gave you the right to bulldoze my family's land?" She tapped the stack of papers in her arms and insisted that Hawthorne Heights HOA had every legal entitlement to develop the property. She gave some runaround explanation about community enrichment, local tourism, and a questionable land transfer that apparently happened shortly after my grandfather's passing. "You can speak with our legal department," Mariana concluded, turning on her heel. "Unless you'd like to join the excitement. We're still selling VIP passes for the grand opening." Her sarcasm felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Standing there, wind rustling the tattered remains of orchard trees, I realized this was no trivial matter. My orchard, my family's orchard, was on the brink of destruction, and the Hawthorne Heights HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't just some nostalgic grandson returning to preserve apple trees. I was a licensed, trial-tested environmental lawyer. I'd shut down illegal logging in Washington state, forced polluting factories in Florida to clean up their emissions, and battled powerful corporations in federal court. If Mariana thought she could wave me off with a polite threat, she was sorely mistaken. As the sun began to set, construction noises echoed across the fields. Metal clanged against metal and engines roared unabated. I stood by the orchard's old wooden fence, remembering simpler days. Grandpa teaching me how to prune branches so they'd bear sweeter fruit, how to compost apple scraps back into the soil. I clenched my fists. I would not let this place become a monument to greed and disregard for the environment. That night, I drove to my childhood home, left unoccupied since Grandpa's passing. As I stepped through the dusty front door, a swirl of nostalgia seized me. Old photos, the familiar scent of aged wood, the distant memory of orchard sounds in the early morning. The stillness broke when my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Gordon, who apologized for not calling earlier. "They have powerful backers, Ethan. Be careful." Powerful backers or not, I was determined to stand my ground, and, no matter how deeply those bulldozers had bitten into the land, I vowed to restore every stolen inch. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The roosters from neighboring farms still crowed in the distance. My first mission was to figure out exactly how the Hawthorne Heights HOA had gotten their claws into my orchard. Grandpa had passed away from heart complications a year and a half ago, leaving me as the sole heir. Could someone have forged signatures or manipulated obscure county records? I drove to the Redfield County Courthouse, a quaint brick building that smelled of old books and fresh coffee. There, I requested all documentation related to the orchard's title. The clerk on duty raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the land's name, Lewis Orchard. She rummaged through her records and handed me a thick folder. A cursory glance was enough to see that something was off. The orchard's boundaries had been redrawn, apparently annexed into Hawthorne Heights' official district lines, but that annexation was nowhere in Grandpa's will. It looked suspicious, especially since the date of the filing was just 1 month after his funeral. I pored over the papers. Words like community benefit, expanded entertainment zone, and special zoning exception jumped out. At the bottom, I saw a scrawl of a signature claiming to be from C. Lewis. I felt my blood boil. I had letters, old checks, and property records with Grandpa's actual signature, and this one didn't match. I snapped photos on my phone to share with a handwriting expert later. Just as I was leaving, I felt a tap on my shoulder. A slight woman in her late 50s, Linda Parker, the courthouse librarian, greeted me quietly. "Excuse me, I overheard you ask about Lewis Orchard. I remember your grandfather well. He was so proud of that orchard." She paused, glancing around nervously. "I've seen Miss Caldwell here multiple times, digging through old zoning laws. She's got connections with the county commissioner. Folks say she can get anything approved if the price is right." Then Linda handed me a sticky note with a phone number. "It's my personal line. If you need any more records, call me after hours." Some documents aren't easy to find. I thanked her, tucking the note away carefully. Mariana's ties to local officials were becoming evident. Outside, the sun had climbed higher. A crisp breeze carried the faint scent of orchard blooms, maybe from a farm untouched by HOA bulldozers. My next stop was Elm and Pine Law Associates, the nearest firm that occasionally took environmental cases. The receptionist directed me to a small waiting area, where I scanned the firm's brochures. Their specialty seemed to be land disputes, but something nagged at me. I needed an ally, but given my own legal expertise, maybe I should handle the case personally. Then again, local attorneys might know the judge, the county commissioners, the planning committees. They could be invaluable. A young lawyer named Josh Ellison greeted me, clean-cut, probably a few years out of law school. He recognized my name from some high-profile environmental lawsuits. "Wait, you're Ethan Lewis, the same Ethan Lewis who argued the Redwood River cleanup case last year." I nodded. He lit up. "I read about that. You basically forced a massive corporation to restore the river ecosystem. Incredible." I explained my predicament, how Hawthorne Heights HOA was erecting a theme park on my orchard, forging signatures, potentially bribing local officials. Josh whistled, shaking his head in disbelief. I knew the HOA had a reputation for heavy-handed rules, like fining people for the wrong shade of fence. But an amusement park? That's a whole new level. Let's see what we can do. He pulled out a legal pad and started jotting notes as I summarized the suspicious documents. We discussed my strategy. file an immediate injunction to halt construction, gather evidence of fraud, then demonstrate to the court that the orchard was wrongly annexed into HOA territory. But as we talked, I realized a hidden card I'd kept in my back pocket: my status as a renowned environmental lawyer with a track record of toppling shady developments. I hadn't revealed that aspect to Mariana, and I wanted to keep it that way. For now. Josh and I parted with a plan to share resources. He'd dig into the county codes while I prepared a more federal-level approach, especially if the orchard's ecosystem fell under certain environmental protections. The orchard had a small stream running through it, which could be classified as a protected water source depending on the fish or wetlands present. If that were the case, the HOA would be in direct violation of federal statutes by building carnival rides over it. I felt a surge of excitement. If I could prove an environmental threat, I could hit them with more than just a local land dispute. On my way out, my phone buzzed, a new text from Mr. Gordon. They started pouring concrete for a roller coaster base near the creek. I'm worried they're blocking the water flow. That was all the motivation I needed. Environmental law was my battlefield, and that orchard was worth protecting, legally, morally, and historically. Despite my anger, I took a deep breath. Step by step. That's how I'd built my career, and that's how I'd dismantled this amusement park fiasco. The orchard's fate wasn't sealed yet, not if I could help it. I arrived at the orchard that afternoon. The scene was worse than I imagined. A towering structure of steel rose from the center of the orchard, part roller coaster, part monstrous contraption glaring against the skyline. Workers were welding rail segments. Sparks flew, mingling with drifting petals from apple blossoms that had miraculously survived the initial bulldozing. The sour taste of horror filled my mouth. I remembered harvesting apples with Grandpa, the orchard quiet except for birdsong and rustling leaves. Now it was a cacophony of machinery, shouting foremen, and clanking metal. I parked near the caretaker's shed, where Mr. Gordon stood with his arms folded. He looked every bit the worried friend he'd always been. Gray hair, furrowed brow, sadness in his eyes. "You see what they've done?" he asked. His voice trembled. "Your grandfather would roll in his grave." Gordon led me to the creek, or what remained of it. A haphazard dam of dirt and debris had been erected to divert the water so they could pour concrete foundations for the ride. The water flow was choked, forming a stagnant pool coated with oily film. My background in environmental law instantly flashed with red flags. Constructing so close to a natural waterway without proper permits was illegal in most states. If a threatened species of fish or amphibian lived there, the HOA would be in even deeper trouble. I snapped dozens of pictures, capturing the muddy water, the half-buried pipe that was presumably draining some of the creek into a different area, and the fresh concrete footings. Each image was a potential piece of evidence. Each piece of evidence was a stepping stone toward halting the project. As I crouched by the creek, I spotted a thin line of plastic netting filled with debris. Possibly they were trying to filter out sediment to avoid an obvious pollution violation, but from the looks of it, they were failing miserably. Clouds of silt drifted downstream. A loud voice startled me. "Hey, you can't be down here." I rose to face a construction foreman, helmet askew on his head. "This is an active site. Authorized personnel only." "I'm authorized," I replied, forcing a calm tone. "This is my land, and you're polluting my creek." He sniffed. "We got permits from the county. If you have an issue, talk to Miss Caldwell." Then he stomped away, apparently too busy to argue. I realized that for these workers, it was just a job. They likely had no idea about the orchard's legacy or the improprieties behind the scenes. Mr. Gordon caught up to me, panting slightly. "They've also cut down some of the older apple trees near the orchard's entrance. Over 100 years old, if I recall correctly. I tried to reason with them, but the HOA threatened me with trespassing charges. Hearing that made my blood boil. Those heirloom trees could never be replaced. "Don't worry, Gordon. We'll make this right." He nodded, looking less sure, but trusting me as he always had. I walked back toward my truck, taking a route that looped behind one of the partially dismantled apple groves. That's when I saw a figure lurking near a half-built concession stand, a slender woman with a notepad, scribbling furiously. She noticed me and gave a nervous smile. "You're Ethan Lewis, right?" she asked. "I'm Sandra White, a reporter for the Redfield Gazette. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Given the press coverage of some of my earlier court cases, it didn't surprise me that a local journalist had recognized me. I nodded. She began to pepper me with inquiries about the orchard's ownership, the rumored forgery, and if I truly intended to block the amusement park's completion. I answered carefully, referencing the suspicious land transfer and my background in environmental law. She seemed sympathetic, even outraged, at how swiftly the orchard was being destroyed. "The Gazette's been receiving calls from concerned residents," she said, flipping pages in her notepad. "A lot of folks in Hawthorne Heights didn't even know about this project until construction was well underway. Mariana Caldwell is claiming it'll bring tourism revenue, but some wonder if the HOA is just lining its own pockets." I let out a bitter laugh. You can be sure they're making bank from ticket sales, vendor contracts, and special tax breaks. And if they paved over a century-old orchard without the rightful owner's permission, well, that's a story worth telling. Sandra promised to stay in touch, slipping away as stealthily as she'd appeared. I sensed the potential power of local media. If the Gazette highlighted the orchard's plight, the HOA might face public backlash. Public opinion could be a powerful ally in a small town like Redfield. Before leaving, I paused near one of the older apple trees that still stood. Its trunk was gnarled, bark worn by decades of wind and rain. I placed my hand on it, remembering how Grandpa once told me that each tree had a soul. It felt almost sacrilegious that the place was overrun by carnival rides. My mind flashed with a memory, Grandpa's booming laughter as he taught me how to plant young saplings. The orchard was more than land. It was a living museum. Steeling myself, I whispered an oath. "I'm not letting them destroy you." If the Hawthorne Heights HOA wanted a fight, I'd give them one they'd never forget. That evening, I drove back into Redfield's town center. The lampposts lining Main Street were lit, casting warm, yellow pools of light onto the sidewalks. The local diner, aptly named Apple Blossom Cafe, was still open, and I decided I could use a strong cup of coffee while I sorted through the orchard's legal puzzle. Inside, the comforting smell of fried food and freshly baked pies mingled in the air. I slid into a booth, pulled out my laptop, and began reviewing the day's photos. My focus was intense, so at first I didn't notice someone approaching until a polite cough made me look up. It was Officer Clint Hayes, a local police officer I vaguely remembered from my younger years. He looked older now, with some gray at his temples. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I nodded, waving him into the seat across from me. Clint fiddled with his cap. "Heard you're back in town, and that you're not too happy about the amusement park. Can't say I blame you." I leaned forward, curious. "So you know about it?" He snorted. "Everyone knows about it. Miss Caldwell and her HOA appear unstoppable around here. The town council rubber stamps her proposals. The county commissioner praises her for bringing jobs and growth." He paused. "But a lot of us wonder if something shadier is going on." I showed him some of the suspicious documents I'd photographed at the courthouse. Forged signatures, misfiled zoning expansions, no public hearing to rezone farmland for commercial use. None of it smells right. Clint grimaced. "That's the consensus. But folks around here are intimidated by her. She runs the HOA like a private fiefdom. If you cross her, you get slapped with fines or code violations. She's threatened to foreclose on people's homes for petty infractions. So people keep quiet. Nobody wants to risk losing their house." My anger deepened. "You're law enforcement. Can't you do anything?" He shrugged helplessly. "Not without proof. And when we bring up allegations, the county commissioner sweeps them under the rug. We get told to focus on real crime." He sighed, pushing to his feet. "If you need anything, let me know. I'd like to see Caldwell face justice for once." After he left, I stared at my half-empty coffee cup, feeling a surge of determination. If the local police had limited leverage and the county officials were compromised, I'd have to approach it from another angle. Federal environmental regulations, maybe. If the orchard stream or unique apple varieties were protected under any ecological law, I could get the feds involved, an approach that no local bigwig could easily hush. Just then, my phone buzzed. Josh Ellison had discovered something huge. "Ethan, I found references to a rare frog species that might inhabit your orchard's creek. If so, the HOA is in deep trouble for ignoring state conservation laws. We need to confirm it ASAP." A flutter of hope rose in my chest. "I'll meet you there at sunrise," I replied. The orchard might hold a hidden biological gem that could turn the tide. Finishing my coffee, I paid the bill and headed outside. Redfield's night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of orchard blossoms from the few untouched groves around town. Gazing at the softly lit windows of the old library across the street, I recalled Grandpa's stories of how Redfield used to be, a place of neighborly trust, small-town pride, and farmland that nurtured generations. Now, it felt like greed had infiltrated every corner. Back at my grandfather's house, I tried to sleep, but my mind was restless. Images of deforestation, roller coasters, and silent orchard groves haunted me. The more I discovered, the more complicated the puzzle became. Mariana's unstoppable influence, the forgery of orchard deeds, the hush-money ties to the county commissioner. My chest tightened with stress. I was used to big legal battles, but this time it was personal. My phone chimed with a text from Sandra White, the reporter. "Stay strong. Tomorrow's paper runs a story highlighting orchard fraud allegations. Caldwell might retaliate. Be safe." Retaliation? I set my phone aside, biting my lip. I'd faced powerful opponents, but rarely in a tight-knit town like Redfield, where social pressure could be brutal. Yet I refused to back down. This orchard was my family's heritage, and it was an environmental sanctuary. If the HOA wanted to ramp up the tension, I had a sharpened arsenal of legal strategies to use against them. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy dreams. Somewhere, in that haze of restless sleep, I heard Grandpa's voice. "Remember, Ethan, the land can't speak for itself. You have to speak for it." His words resonated, pushing me to continue my fight, no matter how intimidating the HOA's power seemed. At the crack of dawn, I sped toward the orchard, a travel mug of black coffee in the cup holder, my heart pounding with anticipation. Josh was already there, kneeling by the creek's edge with a small net. He wore rubber boots, sleeves rolled up. "Morning," he said, voice hushed, as though worried he might scare away any wildlife. The roar of distant machinery echoed beyond a row of half-installed roller coaster tracks. Fortunately, the workers weren't up yet. We had a small window of time to investigate before they started pouring concrete again. I joined Josh at the water's edge, scanning the rippling surface for any signs of frogs or fish. Mud squished beneath my shoes, and the early sun's rays glinted off the water. Josh lifted a stone and gasped. "Look here." Nestled in the damp soil under the rock was a small, greenish-brown frog, sporting distinctive spots on its back. Josh gently scooped it into the net. "If this is the species I think it is," a cascade-spotted frog, "they're protected under Oregon's environmental statutes." My heart leapt. If confirmed, the HOA would need special permits for any construction that could impact the frog's habitat, and from the looks of it, they'd gotten no such clearance. I snapped countless photos, making sure to capture the frog's identifiable markings. Then, I carefully placed it back in the creek, letting it hop away into the reeds. The significance wasn't lost on me. We'd just found a potential legal bombshell. If the orchard's ecosystem hosted a protected species, the Hawthorne Heights HOA couldn't keep building a giant amusement park without undergoing thorough environmental impact studies, and those studies would likely reveal the irreparable harm they'd already caused. After we collected soil samples and tested the water's pH, We retreated to the orchard's perimeter. Josh's face was alight with excitement. "Ethan, this could stop them in their tracks. We just need official confirmation from a recognized environmental agency." I nodded, mentally listing the agencies. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, or even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service if the frog was federally protected. "Let's proceed carefully," I said, checking the time. "We'll gather the evidence. Then we'll file for an emergency injunction on environmental grounds." Before we could celebrate further, we heard angry voices from behind a line of carnival booths under construction. Moments later, Mariana Caldwell appeared, flanked by 2 security guards. She wore a fitted suit despite the early hour, and her expression was livid. "I've had just about enough of these trespassing stunts," she snapped. "This is private property, and you're interfering with ongoing work." "Don't think I won't press charges." I stood my ground. "Private property you stole," I countered, refusing to back away. "I suggest you check your so-called deed. Also, you might want to explain why you're building over potentially protected habitat." Her eyes flickered, a hint of uncertainty crossing her face. Then she scoffed. "We have every permit we need. The county and the state are on my side. This orchard is going to become the region's top tourist attraction." She paused to glare at me. "You, Mr. Lewis, are just a bitter man who's desperate to hold on to the past." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to lose my temper. "We'll see what the courts say," I replied, "and the Department of Fish and Wildlife." Her composure wavered. She turned to the guards. "Escort them off the premises." They moved to flank us. Josh and I exchanged a knowing glance, each stepping away calmly. We'd already gathered the crucial evidence. On the way out, I noticed rows of amusements in various stages of assembly. Teacup rides, a half-finished carousel, even a neon sign that read Lewisland. My blood boiled at the name co-opting, as if to taunt the orchard's true lineage. I said nothing more to Mariana. With each step, I felt the growing weight of my duty to protect not just the orchard's heritage, but the creatures that called it home. Back at my truck, Josh's excitement bubbled over. "We have a strong case, Ethan. You can file a motion in state court referencing the Wildlife Protection Statute. If they're building on critical habitat, that's a big deal." I allowed myself a thin smile, though my heart was still pounding. Mariana doesn't realize she just threatened an environmental lawyer who's taken on some of the nation's biggest polluters. She's about to learn that forging documents and ignoring wetlands law is a path to ruin. I glanced at the orchard one last time, a glint of steel reflecting the rising sun. I'm going to stop them, and in the process, we'll show Redfield that nature matters more than profit. The air felt electric. It was the calm before the storm. I sensed a confrontation coming, one that would pit legal strategy against small-town corruption, big money, and whatever secrets Mariana Caldwell was still hiding. By noon, I found myself juggling phone calls. First, a quick chat with a zoologist friend, confirming the Cascade-spotted frog was indeed on Oregon's protected list. Next, a hurried conversation with the state's environmental hotline, leaving a detailed message about suspected habitat destruction. Finally, a call to a specialized lab that would expedite testing on the water and soil samples. My phone nearly overheated. Around 2 p.m., I got an unexpected text from Sandra White, the Redfield Gazette reporter. "Check your email. Big story. Just went live." Eager, I logged in. Sandra's article was bold, titled, "Local Orchard Faces Hostile Takeover? Possible Fraud by HOA?" She included quotes from an unnamed courthouse source, references to suspicious signatures, and a mention of the orchard's unique ecological features. The coverage felt like a gust of fresh wind, shining a public spotlight on Mariana's shady dealings. Within minutes, my phone rang. Josh, his voice tinged with excitement. "The Gazette article is out. People are talking." I already got 2 calls from local residents who claim the HOA strong-armed them into selling or forced them to pay outrageous fines. This might be bigger than we thought. A small smile tugged at my lips. Good. The more people speak up, the clearer the pattern of abuse becomes. Keep collecting testimonies. I'm filing a new injunction motion in the next 48 hours. Just then, an unknown number flashed on my caller ID. I hesitated, then answered. A gravelly voice spoke. "Mr. Lewis, let's talk. Meet me tonight at the Apple Blossom Cafe, 9 p.m. Don't bring anyone else." The line went dead before I could respond. My pulse quickened. It sounded ominous. Possibly an HOA insider? Or a disgruntled neighbor with information? Though uneasy, I decided to go. If there was a chance to gather more intel on Mariana's operation, I had to take it. But I'd remain cautious. Redfield wasn't a crime-ridden metropolis, but who knew how far the HOA's intimidation might go? Evening approached. I worked feverishly on the court documents. My computer screen glowed in the dim living room, pages of legal arguments referencing Oregon's Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, and local zoning codes. Every paragraph I typed felt like a building block, fortifying my argument to preserve the orchard. The prospect of halting that monstrous amusement park was thrilling, but I knew I had to be thorough. One loophole, one missed detail, and the HOA might wriggle free. As the clock neared 9 p.m., I headed to the Apple Blossom Cafe, parking in a dimly lit corner of the lot. The neon "Open" sign buzzed over the entrance. Inside, the decor was comforting. Checkered tablecloths, twinkling string lights overhead. I scanned the booths for anyone who might have called me. My eyes landed on a hooded figure in the far corner, hunched over a mug of coffee. Heart pounding, I approached. The figure gestured for me to sit. Under the hood was a weary-looking older man with salt and pepper hair. "Name's Franklin Mills," he said quietly, eyes darting around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "Used to work for the Hawthorne Heights HOA. I oversaw some of their property acquisitions." I leaned in, curious but wary. "Why did you call me?" He sighed. "Because what they did to your orchard is dirty. I was part of forging that boundary annexation. Mariana paid off a county official to file it. I have proof. But if she finds out I'm talking to you, I'm done for." My heart raced. This was the kind of direct evidence I needed. Proof like what? Documents? Emails? He reached into a worn briefcase and pulled out a USB drive. Emails between Mariana and the county official discussing the orchard. Also some internal memos about the amusement park plan. They knew the orchard belonged to you, they just didn't care. The official signature page is in there too, scanned from a forged doc. Don't ask how I got it. I clutched the flash drive as if it were gold. "Franklin, this could blow the case wide open. Why come forward now?" His eyes flicked down. "I can't sleep at night, Mr. Lewis. I got grandkids. If they see me involved in something like this..." He shook his head. "I'm done with it." I rested a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. I'll protect your identity as best I can." He stood abruptly, scraping the chair. "Just be careful. Mariana's got powerful friends. She won't hesitate to ruin lives." Then he slipped away, leaving me alone with the USB drive. Adrenaline coursed through me. This was huge. Direct evidence of forgery and bribery could not be ignored by any judge, especially if combined with our environmental claims. The tide was turning swiftly, but the question nagged me. How desperate would Mariana become once she realized her secrets were leaking? I paid for my untouched coffee and walked out into the night air. In the distance, the orchard's silhouette was barely visible, but I could imagine the ghostly shape of roller coaster frames. Clutching the flash drive in my jacket pocket, I felt a surge of renewed purpose. The orchard would be saved, and Mariana's corruption would be laid bare. A text from Sandra White lit up my screen. "Heard a rumor about a secret whistleblower. Hope you're onto something." I smiled grimly, stepping into my truck. Tomorrow, I'd show these revelations to Josh, and we'd finalize the lawsuit. The orchard's defenders were rallying like never before. It was time for the HOA to face consequences. Morning broke with a sense of urgency. I drove to Elm and Pine Law Associates, adrenaline spurring me onward. Inside, Josh's eyes widened at the mention of the USB drive. We plugged it into his computer, scanning through email chains that left no doubt. Mariana had orchestrated a plan to annex the orchard illegally, forging Grandpa's signature with an accomplice at the county office. They'd fast-tracked zoning approvals without public hearings. They'd even predicted potential legal backlash, mocking the idea that any heir would attempt to fight them. One email read, "He's an absentee heir. He won't even know until it's too late." Anger laced my every breath. My mind spun with all the angles we could use. Property fraud? Environmental violations? Conspiracy to commit forgery? Josh typed feverishly, attaching screenshots of relevant emails to our legal motion. "This is airtight, Ethan. The judge can't ignore such blatant evidence." I nodded, face grim. "We'll file for an emergency hearing. I want construction halted immediately. They'll have to stop polluting the creek. They'll have to stop toppling trees." We left the law firm shortly before noon, our formal motion in hand. At the Redfield County Courthouse, we marched down the old hallway with polished floors squeaking under our shoes. The clerk on duty, same one I'd seen on my first day back, looked startled at the thickness of our packet. "You're filing a lot of paperwork," she observed. I shot her a determined grin. "We're seeking justice for the orchard." As we waited for the judge to confirm a hearing date, my phone vibrated. Another text from Mariana. The number was unknown, but I recognized her clip style. "You're playing a risky game. Back off now or your orchard won't be the only thing ruined." My blood chilled. She was threatening me directly. I composed a curt reply. "See you in court." The clerk returned, telling us the emergency hearing was set for the next morning, shockingly fast. Word must have spread about our allegations. Josh exhaled in relief. "Less time for Caldwell to maneuver behind the scenes," he said. "But you should watch your back tonight." No sooner had we stepped outside the courthouse than a news van pulled up. Sandra White hopped out, microphone in hand, a cameraman trailing behind. "Ethan, Josh, can we get a statement about the newly filed motion?" Josh glanced at me, and I nodded. This was our chance to sway public opinion further. The camera rolled, and Sandra's bright smile disappeared as she shifted into serious journalist mode. "Rumor has it you have solid proof of document forgery. Care to comment?" I cleared my throat. "Yes." "We have evidence that the Hawthorne Heights HOA illegally annexed the orchard and forged my grandfather's signature, leading to an unauthorized development of a massive amusement park. We believe the court will halt construction. If the environment is compromised, we'll seek additional federal intervention." Josh chimed in. "We're confident that once the judge reviews the emails and the environmental data, the orchard's rightful ownership and protection will be restored." Sandra asked a few follow-up questions. We stressed that local residents had come forward with stories of harassment, shady deals, and inflated fines. The camera caught every word. By the time we finished, a small crowd had gathered, townspeople curious to see the orchard's fate. Many applauded quietly. Perhaps they'd been victimized by the HOA's harsh policies. Or maybe they simply disliked seeing farmland stripped for roller coasters. As the van drove away, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Officer Clint Hayes. "Heard about your hearing. Watch out for Caldwell's next move. She's not one to go down without a fight." I sighed, turning to Josh. "He's right. She'll try something." Josh nodded, his expression tense. "We'll have to stay vigilant, but we can't let fear derail us now. This hearing could change everything." We parted ways, planning to meet at the courthouse early the next morning. I spent the rest of the day reviewing our case, cross-referencing Oregon's property laws with the environmental statutes. My home office was strewn with binders, notes, and photos of the orchard. I paused occasionally to rub my tired eyes, remembering how Grandpa used to say, "The orchard had a spirit of its own." "Don't worry, Grandpa," I murmured, flipping through another set of legal codes. "By tomorrow, we'll have this travesty exposed." Yet, As night fell, an unease settled over me. Mariana Caldwell was cornered, her entire scheme at risk of collapse. People who feel their power slipping away can become desperate, and I dreaded the possibility of sabotage before morning. But it was too late to turn back. Our evidence was filed, the hearing was set. All we could do now was brace ourselves for a showdown in court, hoping the law would prevail over corruption. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. I arrived at the Redfield County Courthouse extra early. The faint scent of coffee from a nearby cart drifted across the courtyard. Josh was already there, pacing under a grand oak tree. His briefcase bulged with files, and he offered a tight smile when he spotted me. We made our way to the second-floor courtroom, a stately chamber with wooden benches and tall windows letting in beams of sunlight. People filled the seats. Some orchard neighbors, a few local activists concerned about environmental issues, and more than a handful of curious residents who wanted to see how this high-stakes drama would unfold. Officer Clint Hayes stood in the back, nodding reassuringly when our eyes met. Mariana Caldwell swept in moments later, her heels clacking on the polished floor. She wore a sharp pencil skirt and blazer, her posture unyielding. Beside her stood a trio of lawyers in expensive suits. Reinforcements, no doubt. My jaw tightened. Clearly, she'd spared no expense for her defense. The judge, Hans Rebecca Holloway, entered. Everyone rose and then sat at her direction. The hearing began with formalities. Our side presented the motion for an immediate injunction to halt construction. Josh meticulously laid out the evidence: forged signatures, suspicious county annexation records, the presence of a protected frog species, and the potential environmental harm from building a park over a creek. We submitted the USB drive's emails, letting the glaring truths speak for themselves. Each exhibit felt like another nail in Mariana's coffin. When it was the defense's turn, Mariana's lead attorney, a tall man named Richard Stern, tried to downplay the evidence. He labeled the emails unverified and insisted the orchard had been legally transferred via an estate settlement agreement. He then questioned the authenticity of the frog sightings, claiming no official wildlife agency had confirmed it. I felt my patience wane. I rose for rebuttal, explaining my background as an environmental lawyer, finally revealing to the court what I'd kept hidden from Mariana. Her expression shifted from smug confidence to sudden apprehension. I recited my credentials, pointed out the numerous cases I'd won involving habitat destruction, and told the judge we'd already contacted the appropriate agencies for an expedited review. The defendants have not only violated local zoning laws, they've trampled on environmental protections. Their entire project rests on fraudulent foundations. Judge Holloway folded her hands, her gaze stern. Miss Caldwell, do you have any direct evidence proving your right to build an amusement park on this orchard? Mariana squirmed under the spotlight, referencing her permits and community backing, but the judge frowned at the forged signature revelations. It seems there are multiple red flags concerning your property claims, she added, arching an eyebrow. Mariana's final attempt at a defense came in the form of a tearful speech about improving Redfield's economy and bringing joy to families. She pandered to the public good, but the judge's unimpressed expression suggested it wouldn't suffice. After a tense pause, Judge Holloway stated her provisional ruling: the court was granting our request for a temporary injunction. Effective immediately, all construction at the orchard site was to cease until the matter of rightful ownership and environmental compliance could be fully resolved. A ripple of murmurs crossed the gallery. People exchanged relieved smiles. Officer Hayes nodded, satisfied. I managed to keep my composure, though inside I felt an overwhelming surge of triumph. The orchard was safe for now. No more roller coasters. No more bulldozers ripping into decades-old apple trees. The judge declared that a follow-up hearing would occur within a few weeks to determine permanent solutions. As the gavel struck, Mariana's face hardened. Rage flickered in her eyes. For an instant, I thought she might lash out. Instead, she pivoted on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her attorneys trailing behind. The hush lifted as soon as she left. Locals in the courtroom turned to each other, whispering about how the mighty HOA had been challenged at last. Josh patted my back, a grin splitting his face. "We did it, Ethan. At least for now. A huge step." I exhaled, releasing pent-up tension. "Let's be ready for whatever she tries next," I said quietly. "She won't accept defeat easily." Clint Hayes approached, shaking my hand. "Congratulations! You probably saved that orchard from further destruction. I'm glad the judge saw through the smokescreen." Outside the courthouse, the local press was waiting. Sandra White among them, microphones thrust forward, cameras rolling. I explained the injunction, emphasizing that the fight wasn't over, but that this was a major victory for the orchard and the environment. Over my shoulder, I glimpsed some of the orchard's neighbors cheering softly. They had tears of joy in their eyes, and gratitude shone on their faces. For once, Redfield had challenged the Hawthorne Heights HOA and won a critical round. My phone buzzed with messages from across the region. Environmental groups I'd worked with before congratulated me, offering support if the case escalated. It felt surreal that just days ago I stood helpless in the orchard, dismayed by roller coasters amid apple trees. Now, we had a legal shield, a community rallying behind us, an exposure of the HOA's corruption. As I climbed into my truck, I rested my hands on the steering wheel, letting the moment wash over me. The orchard's survival was no longer a faint hope. It was well on its way to reality. Still, I reminded myself that Mariana's downfall wasn't yet guaranteed. She might try sabotage or use her political connections to undermine the injunction. But we'd face that storm when it came. For now, the orchard was safe from bulldozers. And that alone was worth savoring. The following week felt like a whirlwind. Redfield buzzed with talk of the court's decision. Some folks rejoiced, others whispered about possible retribution. True to form, Mariana didn't lie low. Instead, rumors spread that she was pressuring the county commissioner to declare some public safety hazard at the orchard, hoping to override the injunction. However, the judge's authority overshadowed the commissioner's powers, so that ploy hit a dead end. Meanwhile, more residents came forward with testimonies of HOA harassment. One elderly couple described how Mariana tried to coerce them into selling their small orchard plot. A single mother recounted crippling fines for unauthorized plantings in her front yard. In each case, it was clear the Hawthorne Heights HOA twisted local regulations for profit. I spend hours each day compiling these accounts, adding them to the growing case file. The final hearing was still weeks off, and we intended to ensure the judge saw just how extensive the HOA's misconduct was. In that sense, Mariana's attempt to build an amusement park had backfired. It shone a spotlight on every questionable tactic the HOA had ever used. Late one evening, I was poring over transcripts in my grandfather's old study, the lamp casting a warm glow on the dusty desk. A soft knock startled me. Opening the door, I found a trembling Mr. Gordon, eyes rimmed with fear. "Ethan, I think someone's messing around the orchard at night," he whispered. "I've heard vehicles, light beams scanning the place. I'm worried they might vandalize it." My stomach clenched. "I'll drive out there now." Moments later, the two of us were in my truck, winding down the moonlit country road that led to the orchard gates. The silhouettes of half-completed roller coaster tracks loomed ominously against the night sky. Sure enough, as we approached the fence, headlights illuminated a corner of the orchard. A figure in dark clothes scrambled away, jumping into an SUV. The vehicle sped off, tires spraying gravel. We hopped out, scanning the area. Nothing seemed immediately damaged, but the orchard's caretaker's shed door was ajar. Inside, we found the lock broken. "They might have been searching for something," Mr. Gordon said, voice shaky. I called Officer Hayes, who arrived promptly, taking our statements and shining a flashlight around for clues. "Could be an intimidation tactic," he muttered. "Let me know if you notice anything missing." He sighed. "Caldwell's losing her grip, and that can make people desperate." The next day, we discovered that some orchard documents, mostly old diaries of my grandfather detailing pruning schedules and harvest yields, were strewn about, as though someone rummaged but didn't find what they wanted. I felt a pang, imagining them discarding Grandpa's words so carelessly. We installed better locks and motion sensor lights, but the sense of unease lingered. It seemed Mariana or her allies were testing how far they could push, reminding us they weren't going down without a fight. But every act of intimidation only steeled my resolve. I brought these incidents to the judge's attention, adding them to the official record as potential harassment. The last thing the HOA needed was more legal trouble. In the midst of this tension, a beacon of hope arrived. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife officially recognized the Orchards Creek as habitat for the Cascade spotted frog, triggering state-level protections. Their letter included a directive that any further interference with the waterway could result in fines or criminal charges. I practically cheered when I read it. Combined with the injunction, it meant the orchard was doubly shielded through property rights and environmental safeguards. When I shared the news with the orchard's neighbors, applause broke out. Some folks cried tears of joy, expressing relief that Redfield's farmland might finally escape the HOA's iron grip. Even the local diner, Apple Blossom Cafe, pinned a note on their bulletin board, "Save our orchard, victory in sight." Gazing at that sign, I felt a surge of gratitude for Redfield's community spirit. Through all the fear and bullying, people were standing tall. And I intended to see this through to the end, ensuring Mariana Caldwell's actions were fully exposed. Weeks later, the day of the permanent hearing arrived. The courthouse brimmed with tension. News cameras lined the sidewalk. Townsfolk crowded the halls, whispering anxiously. Josh and I carried boxes of evidence, our expressions solemn but determined. This was the moment we'd worked toward, the showdown that would decide the orchard's ultimate fate. Mariana appeared with her top dollar legal team. Her face was set in a tight mask of defiance, yet the exhaustion behind her eyes was unmistakable. The hearing began with both sides presenting final arguments. Josh recapped the evidence of forgery, the environmental violations, the intimidation tactics. I delivered a passionate plea about the orchard's historical and ecological importance. Then we revealed the official statement from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The room collectively held its breath. Mariana's lead attorney tried to counter, but their arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming proof. They had no plausible explanation for the forged signature, no legitimate rebuttal to the habitat destruction claims. In a last desperate attempt, they touted the project's economic benefits. But the judge was unimpressed. With a measured tone, she weighed the arguments. The rustle of papers, the quiet coughs in the gallery, and the tension between us and the HOA formed a silent soundtrack to her deliberation. Finally, Judge Holloway cleared her throat. After reviewing all evidence, it's clear that the orchard was never lawfully transferred to Hawthorne Heights HOA. The construction permits were obtained under false pretenses. Moreover, the presence of a protected frog species mandates strict environmental compliance, which the defendants flagrantly ignored. Therefore, I rule in favor of Mr. Ethan Lewis. The orchard shall be returned to his rightful ownership, and the unauthorized amusement park project is permanently halted. Additional legal penalties may apply for forgery and environmental harm. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Murmurs of relief, awe, even a few cheers erupted from the orchard supporters. Mariana stood frozen, color draining from her face. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. Her attorneys conferred frantically, but the judge's gavel struck the bench, finalizing the decision. I let out a shaky breath, tears pricking my eyes. Josh squeezed my shoulder, beaming. We turned toward the gallery where Mr. Gordon, neighbors, and Redfield residents openly rejoiced. Sandra White raised her camera to capture the moment, a triumphant grin on her face. Stepping outside, I was greeted by sunshine and a throng of onlookers. A round of applause broke out. People shook my hand, offered heartfelt thanks. "You saved the orchard, Ethan," an elderly man said, tears in his eyes. "Your grandfather would be so proud." The media swarmed, I gave a brief statement, emphasizing that nature and justice had prevailed, but also cautioning that vigilance was needed to prevent future abuses. As the cameras clicked and the crowd buzzed, I spotted Mariana slipping away, flanked by her lawyers. Her face was a storm of bitterness and disbelief. I felt a pang. Despite her wrongdoings, I couldn't help but wonder if she'd face legal consequences for the forgery and bribes, but that was for prosecutors to decide. My orchard was safe, and that was enough for me right then. In the following weeks, the half-built amusement park structures were dismantled under court order. The roller coaster frames were carted off, and the orchard's ground was painstakingly cleared of debris. Environmental experts arrived to restore the creek's natural flow, planting native vegetation to stabilize the banks. Locals volunteered to help replant young apple trees in areas bulldozed beyond repair. A sense of renewal and unity swept across Redfield. An affirmation that no matter how powerful a bully might seem, justice can still reign if good people refuse to back down. One crisp autumn morning, I stood by the orchard's edge, inhaling the scent of fallen leaves and the lingering sweetness of ripe apples. The land looked a bit bruised, but with time and care, it would thrive again. I placed a hand on the old orchard fence, recalling Grandpa's voice, "Give the earth love, and it'll give back tenfold." As I watched a cluster of birds flutter from branch to branch, I felt overwhelming peace. The orchard, once threatened by greed and corruption, was now a sanctuary once more, safe, vibrant, and ready to nurture future generations. Above all, I realized that my fight wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about protecting a legacy and reminding the world that some things, like the harmony of nature and the heritage of family, are beyond any price tag. Walking away, I took one final look at the orchard. A swirl of golden leaves danced in the breeze, a testament to resilience. The HOA built a giant amusement park on my orchard and discovered too late that I'm a renowned environmental lawyer. They never saw it coming. And now, they're the ones left picking up the pieces.